Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend where the sea remembers what the world forgot. Far beyond the familiar shores of ancient Greece, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, there was said to be a mighty island kingdom called Atlantis. It was a place of shining temples, sacred rings of water, golden halls, powerful kings, and a beauty so great that later ages could hardly believe it had ever existed. But every great kingdom carries a hidden question inside its splendor. How long can power remain pure? How long can wealth serve wisdom before it begins to feed pride? And what happens when a civilization blessed by the gods starts to believe that no boundary can hold it? This is not only the story of a city swallowed by the sea, it is the story of memory, pride, warning, and loss. It begins in the quiet temple of Sais, where Solon, the wise lawgiver of Athens, heard from Egyptian priests that his own people had forgotten a past older than their songs. From there, the path leads westward, toward a kingdom built by Poseidon's hand, ruled by descendants of divine blood, and slowly changed by ambition. As you listen, let the waves rise gently in your imagination and follow this ancient tale into the shining streets, sacred temples, silent judgments, and final darkness of Atlantis. Before we begin this epic, I have a small request that means a lot to me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The greatest reward for all the effort I put into creating these epics is your support through subscribing to my channel. If you enjoy my content and want me to continue creating more, your subscription and truly give me great motivation. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Your comments not only encourage me, but also help me understand what kind of epics and stories you would like to see on this channel. Thank you so much in advance for your support. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of this ancient legend guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of the fall of Atlantis, a journey through the sunken kingdom, begins now. Solon came to Sais after years of travel, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had given laws to his city and then stepped away before praise or complaint could trap him. Egypt received him with the patience of a land that measured time by rivers, temples, and inscriptions older than the memory of most nations. In the district sacred to Neith, where stone courts opened beneath a wide and steady sky, the priests did not hurry to admire Athens, nor did they treat the Greek visitor as a stranger unworthy of old things. They listened to him as he recited the names of heroes known among his people, the tales of floods, founders, and noble houses, and they let the words settle in the cool air of the sanctuary before one elderly priest answered with a gentleness that made the correction more lasting than rebuke. The silence around that correction did not humiliate him. It steadied him, as if the temple itself had asked him to set aside the comfort of familiar praise before entering older ground. The priest told Solon that the Greeks were still young in the knowledge of the world, not because their minds were weak, but because disaster had again and again taken memory from them. Fire from heaven, water from the earth, and the turning of ages had stripped many peoples of letters and records, leaving only children of survivors to begin again on bare ground. Egypt, he said, had been spared certain destructions by the nature of the Nile and the guarded discipline of its temples. There, in sacred writings, deeds remained that other nations had forgotten. Solon, who had come as a lawgiver and poet, stood before shelves of memory that did not flatter him. His face, weathered by public life and travel, grew still as the priest spoke, for he understood that a man could be old and still belong to a young city. In that moment, history became less like a chain of proud names and more like a shore repeatedly washed clean, where only those who carved deeply enough could hope to leave a mark. Then the priest led him deeper into the thought of the place, not by opening every sealed chamber, but by unfolding a single story with care. Long before the Athens known to Solon, there had been another Athens, older, sterner, and more excellent in its customs. Its people had once been praised among the nations for courage, order, and a form of life in which guardians served the whole city rather than private appetite. Solon had heard echoes of heroes in song, yet the priest placed before him something more severe than song, a memory of civic virtue tested by a danger that had come from the far western sea. The account did not begin with the fall of a city or the triumph of another. It began with the uncomfortable knowledge that the past was larger than the stories men kept nearest to their pride. The thought altered the atmosphere of the room, turning every painted sign and sealed record into evidence that a city might possess greatness and still mislay the path back to it. In the temple of Sais, the daylight did not enter like a shout. It lay across pillars and painted surfaces in quiet sheets, softening the faces of divine figures and the hands of scribes who had once cut names into stone. Solon looked at the priest not as a guest asking for wonders, but as a man who sensed that his own poetry had found a harder master. The priest's manner carried no theatrical secrecy. He seemed less like one guarding a treasure than one deciding how much weight another soul could bear. Around them, the temple breathed with the slow confidence of a place built to outlast individual grief, and the story waiting there did not glitter at first. It waited like a dark line beyond a calm sea. Solon felt how little the chamber needed ornament beyond its age. Even the dust along the stones seemed to have more discipline than the hurried fame of men. The priest spoke of a power once situated beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where the familiar sea opened toward the greater ocean. From there, he said, a mighty island realm had extended its influence across waters and coasts, gathering strength until its ambition moved toward the inner sea and the lands around it. He did not yet give Solon all its measurements, treasures, temples, or kings. He only placed before him the shape of a coming pressure, a force from outside the known circle of Greek memory, immense enough to test nations and disciplined enough to make fear appear orderly. Solon listened with the tightening attention of a statesman, for he knew that great danger did not always arrive in disorder. Sometimes it came adorned with law, wealth, ships, and confidence. This restraint made the first outline of Atlantis more compelling, for the priest seemed to be withholding grandeur until Solon had learned to receive it without childish wonder. The old priest paused before the story widened, and the pause itself seemed part of the lesson. Solon, who had governed men, recognized the silence of a teacher who wished the listener to enter the account without vanity. Nothing in the priest's tone asked him to believe in marvel for its own sake. The tale was offered as a record of greatness, danger, and the fragility of memory, preserved not to entertain travelers, but to steady those who might otherwise mistake prosperity for permanence. Outside the temple, the city of Sais moved through its ordinary day, with priests, servants, merchants, and river light passing through their appointed rhythms. Inside, Solon stood beside an older history, and the name of Atlantis had begun to rise from the walls without yet revealing the depth beneath it. The name did not strike the air like a proclamation. It entered softly, and because it entered softly, it seemed to belong to something too large to be summoned by noise. Before the priest continued, the temple seemed to gather the distance between Egypt and Greece into one breath. Solon had crossed seas to learn foreign customs, yet the foreign sanctuary had returned him to his own city by a path he had not expected. The story's first movement therefore did not pull him away from Athens. It unsettled Athens beneath his feet. He had known laws as human arrangements, debated and amended among citizens. Now he heard that law, memory, disaster, and divine order could be braided across thousands of years. The lesson did not arrive as doctrine. It arrived as architecture, climate, and an old man's measured voice among records that had outlived the pride of many rulers. By the time the priest prepared to speak of Athens before remembered Athens, Solon was no longer merely collecting material for a poem. He was standing before a past that asked to be received with humility. The priest began not with Atlantis but with Athens, and that choice unsettled Solon more than any wonder might have done. A lesser storyteller would have hurried toward the vast island beyond the western strait, toward its metals, canals, kings, and ships. The Egyptian did not. He first set before the lawgiver an image of his own ancestral city, not the Athens of familiar temples and living families, but an Athens buried beneath lost ages. It had stood, he said, in a land whose shape had not yet been worn down to the barer bones known in later times. Its hills had carried deeper soil, its fields had held stronger nourishment, and its people had lived with a disciplined simplicity that made the city firm before it became famous. Solon felt the strangeness of being introduced to his homeland as if it belonged to someone else. That reversal gave the account a quiet power, because it forced Solon to approach the western danger through the character of the city that would one day meet it. That ancient Athens had been ordered with a clarity that matched the philosopher's dream of a just city. Its guardians had not owned private riches in the manner of traders or landholders, and their lives had been shaped towards service rather than display. The priest did not describe them as joyless. He made them seem lean, attentive, and bound together by a common purpose that left little room for ornamental vanity. Their women and men shared in the responsibilities of the city, according to the older account, and their courage did not grow from noise. It grew from training, restraint, and an inward loyalty to the whole. In the cool chamber, as the priest's voice moved steadily onward, Athens became less a place on a map than a form of character, remembered because it had once stood upright when easier nations bent. The priest's tone suggested that such order was not an accident of poverty, but a deliberate shaping of life, repeated until restraint became almost second nature. The land around that first city seemed almost to live in the telling. The priest spoke of the Acropolis, before later floods and rains had stripped it of much of its covering, when it had held dwellings, sanctuaries, and the practical arrangements of a settled people. Springs, fields, and slopes appeared not as decorative background, but as the body of a city joined to its laws. The people had not treated the earth as a stage beneath ambition. They had lived as if the ground itself expected moderation. This was not the softness of a golden age without labor. It was a harder peace, maintained by those who understood that disorder often entered a city through small permissions before it announced itself as ruin. To Solon, the image carried the ache of a recovered inheritance, not a treasure to possess, but a standard against which the living might suddenly feel smaller. Solon heard in this description both praise and accusation. His own Athens loved story, argument, contest, and the shine of human excellence. Yet the city described by the priest seemed older than reputation, formed before memory had learned to decorate itself. The Egyptian's calm delivery made the account more persuasive, because he did not ask Solon to admire it by force. He let the image gather weight through details, the separation of functions, the honor paid to trained defenders, the simplicity of civic life, the absence of needless luxury among those entrusted with protection. What moved Solon was not that his ancestors had been great. It was that their greatness, if the record held true, had been almost entirely forgotten by those who claimed descent from them. Such details gave the forgotten city a human scale, allowing its virtue to appear through water jars, training grounds, shared meals, and watchful gates rather than through abstract praise. Only after this first Athens had taken shape did the priest allow the shadow beyond the sea to lengthen. He spoke of a time when many peoples faced pressure from a Western power whose reach had already crossed islands and coasts. The Athenians of that earlier age had not sought glory as a prize. They had been drawn into the trial because their order made them capable of resistance. There was no rush yet toward the field, no sudden clash, no premature ending. The priest's account moved as a river does before narrowing between rocks, broad, steady, and carrying in its depth the force of what would come later. Solon understood that a city's greatest deed could not be understood apart from the habits that had prepared it. The threat therefore approached not a helpless settlement, but a civic body already formed by habits strong enough to endure fear without worshipping it. The old priest did not flatter the Greeks by saying that memory alone made men noble. Memory had failed them. Songs had kept fragments, names, and shining surfaces, but the deeper civic truth had gone down beneath later catastrophes. What remained in Egypt was not merely an old tale of one city against another. It was a record of how a well-ordered people had met a power greater in wealth and wider in reach. Solon stood within the temple's measured shade and saw, perhaps for the first time, that a civilization could survive in stone after it had disappeared from its own descendants' minds. The priest's hand rested near the sacred records, and beyond the account of ancient Athens, the western island waited like a closed gate. That was the first grief of the tale. Not that Athens had once suffered, but that its noblest memory had survived more faithfully in a foreign sanctuary than at home. The priest's ordering of the account had its own discipline. He gave Solon the city first, then the threat, because a deed could not be measured until the character behind it had been seen. If Atlantis had entered too early, its brightness might have swallowed the older Athens and turned the story into a marvel of scale. Instead, the listener was made to dwell with modest strength before meeting imperial splendor. This made the future contrast sharper. The first Athens appeared almost austere beside the power waiting beyond the pillars, yet its austerity was not emptiness. It was preparation. Its people had fewer surfaces to polish, fewer luxuries to defend, fewer illusions about the purpose of public life. The temple chamber in Sais held that image before Solon, like a lamp set low, and the western shadow waited beyond it. The western name had still not taken the room from Athens. It waited nearby, like a sound not yet released from a closed door. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where the known sea opened toward a wider and more mysterious water, the priest placed the island of Atlantis. He spoke of it not as a rumor drifting among sailors, but as a realm whose scale had once seemed to challenge the imagination of inland peoples. It was said to have been larger than Libya and Asia together, as Greeks used those names, and it stood at the threshold of routes leading outward to other islands and to the great land beyond. The image did not belong to a small kingdom hidden in mist. It belonged to a power seated at the edge of the familiar world, close enough to send ships inward, distant enough to acquire the grandeur of a horizon no ordinary traveler could measure. The farther the priest carried the listener westward, the more the familiar world seemed to narrow behind him, as if Greece itself had become only one coast among many. The waters around it were not merely empty distance. In the priest's telling, they formed a passage between worlds of knowledge, the enclosed sea of older trade and politics on one side, the vast outer ocean on the other. Atlantis had grown, where movement itself could become dominion. From such a place, ships could gather metals, timber, animals, tribute, and news. Kings could imagine their island not as a boundary, but as a center. The sea gave them reach, and reach gave them a habit of command. Solon, listening in Sais, would have understood how geography could shape ambition. A city on a hill learned one kind of discipline. A realm facing open water learned another, broader, more restless, and more dangerous when restraint began to loosen. In this way, the island's setting became part of its character, for a people placed between entrance and immensity could easily confuse opportunity with entitlement. The priest did not yet lead Solon into every inner ring of the island city. He first let Atlantis stand whole in the mind, western, powerful, sea-facing, and rich in approaches. Its nearness to the pillars meant that it watched the gate between the outer and inner waters. Its distance from Greece allowed its presence to grow in the imagination before its armies ever appeared. Nations within the Mediterranean might have heard of it first through merchants, then through envoys, then through rumors that came with cargoes and warnings. A power that lived beyond the strait could feel almost unreal until its ships entered familiar harbors. That delayed recognition made Atlantis more frightening than a neighbor, because by the time its purpose became clear, its strength had already been formed elsewhere. The imagination of those who heard such reports would have filled the distance with rumor, giving the island a majesty that arrived before its ships were seen. From the western island, authority had extended across regions named in the old account, with a statesman's precision. Parts of Libya had felt its pressure as far as Egypt, and parts of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. These names did not turn the story into a dry map. They gave its ambition a body. Atlantis was not great merely because its palaces shone or its temple roofs were bright. It was great because its power moved, organized, and demanded recognition. The priest's voice carried no excitement when he described that reach, and the restraint sharpened the image. In sleepier tales, empires arrive with thunder. In this older memory, empire advanced through routes, alliances, possessions, harbors, and the gradual acceptance of its own inevitability. Those place names stretched the account across the listener's mind, turning Atlantis from a marvel of architecture into a political weight pressing upon many shores. Yet Atlantis could not be understood only through fear. Before it became a danger to others, it had been a marvel in itself. Its origin lay in divine allotment, in the portion given to Poseidon when the gods were said to have divided the earth among themselves. Its first shape had been formed not by conquest, but by a god's desire by a mortal woman named Cleito, and by a hill enclosed in alternating circles of land and water. The priest allowed this deeper beginning to wait until the island's political magnitude had been felt. Thus the listener did not mistake Atlantis for a simple monster of wealth. It was more tragic than that. It had begun with order, beauty, and sacred favor. Its first sacredness would make its later ambition more troubling, because corruption in a favored place carried a sorrow that ordinary tyranny could not equal. Solon, trained by law and poetry alike, must have sensed the tension in that arrangement. A place born from divine care and placed at the ocean's gate could become either guardian or devourer. The priest had not declared its end. He had not yet spoken of the day when sea and earth altered its fate. Instead, he had set Atlantis upon the horizon of the story with enough majesty to make its later movement matter. In the temple of Sais, beneath the patient gaze of Egyptian images, the western island grew from name into presence. It waited beyond the pillars, not as a sunken memory yet, but as a living power whose roads of water had begun to turn inward. The priest allowed that tension to remain unresolved, so the island entered the story neither condemned nor excused, but alive with possibilities that had not yet chosen their direction. The description of Atlantis therefore entered the story as both revelation and delay. Solon had been shown the city that would resist before he was shown the grandeur that would advance, and that order preserved the narrative's tension. The island beyond the pillars did not appear already condemned. It appeared magnificent, strategically placed, divinely rooted, and politically awake. Its later danger would matter because its beginning and position were not trivial. As the priest unfolded the Western geography, the listener could feel curiosity rather than certainty. What kind of people had grown at that oceanic threshold? How had a sacred allotment become a force felt as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia? The answers waited inside the island, within the rings that Poseidon had first made for love rather than conquest. Beyond that question, the room in Sais seemed to lengthen toward the sea, and Solon sat within it as though the horizon itself had entered the temple. At the heart of the island's beginning stood a hill, And upon that hill lived Avenor Leucippe and their daughter Cleito. The priest's account softened when it reached them, as if even a story of empires needed one still house before the world widened around it. Avenor and Leucippe did not appear as conquerors or founders in the usual sense. They belonged to the land before its magnificence had been organized, before canals carried ships through rings, and before kings measured their inheritance in territories. Cleito, left alone after the death of her parents, became the mortal center around which the divine portion of Atlantis first gathered. In her, the story changed scale. The vast island beyond the Pillars became intimate, marked by solitude, beauty, and the attention of the sea god. Their small domestic presence kept the story from beginning in abstraction. Before there were kings and fleets, there had been a household vulnerable to time. Poseidon, to whom that region had fallen in the allotment of the gods, loved Cleito and enclosed the hill where she lived. Around it he made alternating belts of sea and land, each circle held within another, so that the central place became both protected and set apart. The image carried more than wonder. It suggested a sacred geometry, a pattern in which desire had been translated into defense, nearness, and distance. Water embraced the land, land held back the water, and the mortal woman's dwelling became the first enclosed heart of Atlantis. No army had dug those rings. No king had commanded them. They belonged to the earliest shape of the island's meaning, when power still appeared as protection and separation as care. The rings therefore felt less like a fortress than a vow shaped into geography, a divine gesture that made tenderness visible through earth and water. From Poseidon and Cleito came 5 pairs of twin sons, and through them the royal houses of Atlantis began. The eldest was Atlas, whose name passed to the island and to the surrounding sea. After him came his twin, called Gedairis in the Greek account, and the remaining brothers whose portions completed the sacred number. The priest did not need to make each infant a character in a household scene. Their importance lay in the division of rule that followed from birth. Poseidon gave to each a share, but to Atlas he gave the central house and the first authority. Thus, Atlantis was not imagined as a kingdom born from a single human seizure. It had been arranged from the beginning as a layered inheritance with kinship, territory, and sacred order joined together. Atlas received more than seniority. He received the burden of becoming a name by which the island, the sea, and the memory of rule would later be known. The first rulers inherited more than land. They inherited the memory of a god's design. The circles around Cleito's hill became the model of a civilization that loved pattern, proportion, enclosure, and access carefully controlled. Later generations would cut channels through the rings, build bridges, raise walls, and adorn the center with metals. Yet before all of that, the shape itself already spoke. It told the islanders that greatness meant ordered nearness to the sacred center. It told them that the sea could be mastered only by respecting the boundaries that made mastery possible. It told them that a place of favor could still require discipline. Such lessons did not sound like commands at first. They were built into the ground. Later, citizens might have crossed those passages without thinking of their first meaning, yet the old shape remained beneath every bridge and harbor they built. The hill, held between sea and earth, became a private world before it became a public center. There was tenderness in this beginning, but not innocence without danger. A city born from divine intimacy could easily mistake its origin for permission. The descendants of Poseidon could remember that their blood touched the god, while forgetting that the first divine act had been enclosure, not expansion. Cleito's protected hill would one day stand beneath temples, palaces, and offerings from 10 allotments. Its simplicity would be covered by ceremonial splendor. Still, in the beginning, the story held a quieter light. The sea god had not raised Atlantis to dominate the inner world. He had marked a place, loved a mortal, and made a refuge where water and land circled one another in solemn balance. That contrast between origin and later desire made the foundation scene quietly tragic, even before any fault had appeared among the descendants. Before marble, before processions, before the heavy language of empire, there had been only enclosure, shelter, and a mortal name remembered, because a god had turned toward it. Solon heard this origin as a poet would have heard it, but also as a lawgiver. He knew that founding stories became instructions, even when later generations no longer obeyed them. The priest did not pause to preach that point. He allowed the image of Cleito's hill to remain. One mortal woman, one god of the sea, 10 sons, and a pattern of rings that would later guide the hands of engineers and kings. The island's future magnificence had been hidden inside that first shape. So had its temptation. For any people who lived within circles of protection might, in time, look outward and believe every other shore was meant to become another ring around themselves. The protected hill stayed in the imagination like a seed beneath marble, reminding the listener that the entire empire had grown from something far more delicate than empire. Its first silence therefore mattered. It kept the beginning human enough for the later grandeur to feel like an alteration, not merely an increase. From that origin, the later city drew both its strength and its danger. Every canal, temple, and law would in some way return to the first enclosure around Cleito. If the descendants remembered the tenderness of that beginning, their rule could remain measured. If they remembered only the divine privilege attached to it, the same beginning could feed a dangerous certainty. The priest's account allowed both futures to exist for a moment. Cleito's hill was peaceful, yet it stood at the center of a pattern capable of becoming royal, architectural, ceremonial, and imperial. The listener could rest there briefly, as one rests in the early light before a long day, knowing only that the first shape of Atlantis had been beautiful enough to make its eventual distortion painful. For a moment, Atlantis rested inside that first pattern, still closer to a household than a throne, still nearer to promise than command. When the priest opened the island itself before Solon, Atlantis ceased to be only a sacred center and became a wide living country. It was said to have held a richness that answered nearly every human need before desire had time to become anxious. From the mountains came stone, timber, and veins of metal. From the fields came harvests made generous by soil and climate. From the forests came animals both useful and marvelous to those who told the tale. The account named elephants among them, not as decoration, but as a sign that the island's abundance had seemed almost complete. In another telling, such details might have hardened into a list. In the temple's hush, they became the movement of a traveler crossing valleys, groves, watercourses, and slopes, where each part of the land offered something different to human hands. Each resource arrived in the telling as part of a breathing landscape, not as possessions stacked in a treasury, and that made the island's later misuse more intimate. The island's fertility did not appear as effortless luxury. It had a rhythm, and its people had learned to receive from it in many seasons. Fruits grew in forms that served nourishment and pleasure. Roots, grains, and trees gave what households, feasts, builders, and ships required. Springs of cold and warm water rose from the ground, joining utility with wonder. A listener could imagine morning steam above certain basins, workers carrying jars, animals moving slowly through shaded places, and distant axes sounding in woods that still seemed inexhaustible. The land's abundance was not yet morally dark. It was beautiful, and the beauty mattered. A tragic realm had to be loved before its failure could carry weight. Atlantis had not been a barren power craving what it lacked. It had been rich enough to have chosen restraint. The listener could sense that labor and gift had once moved together there, so that human skill completed what the land began, rather than merely exhausting it. Among its gifts, the metals shone with special force. Gold and silver had their known brightness, but the account gave particular attention to orichalcum, a metal precious in ancient memory, gleaming with a fiery or reddish light and used throughout the island's sacred and royal spaces. The priest did not hold it up as a magician would hold a charm. He let it appear in walls, pillars, surfaces, and ceremonial places where wealth became visible at every turn. Solon, who had written laws against the disorders of excess in his own city, would have understood the danger of such daily brilliance. When splendor surrounded a people from childhood, it could stop feeling like blessing and begin to feel like evidence that they were exempt from ordinary measure. Its glow gave sacred spaces a warmer, stranger life, and the people who handled it must have felt that their island possessed a substance other lands only dreamed of. The island's animals and plants gave further scale to its world. There were creatures for labor, creatures for ceremony, and creatures that suggested the breadth of the land's climates and spaces. Trees supplied fragrance, construction, shade, and food. Fields answered the plow. Hills answered the mason. Springs answered thirst. The outer districts sent their offerings toward the royal center, and the center reflected them back in festivals, buildings, and public works. Nothing in this movement was by itself corrupt. Order could gather abundance and distribute it with grace. Yet the account quietly allowed another possibility to emerge. When every need was met and every surface could be made brighter, human appetite did not always become grateful. Sometimes it became more skilled at inventing new forms of wanting. The danger lay not in plenty itself, but in the ease with which repeated plenty could make gratitude seem unnecessary to those born after the struggle was forgotten. The priest's description moved through the island as if through a long day. Morning belonged to fields and springs, noon to workshops and roads, evening to smoke rising near houses and ships returning toward the harbors. In that motion, Atlantis felt less like an abstract symbol and more like a country full of ordinary dependencies. Farmers, builders, sailors, herders, metalworkers, priests, and rulers all stood behind the objects named in the record. Their lives were not individually preserved, yet their labor gave the island its human warmth. The great tragedy hidden in the story was not only that palaces would vanish, it was that an entire arrangement of work, weather, skill, and expectation would be folded into a memory too vast for any single person to hold. Because the account allowed these workers to remain unnamed, they became almost universal, standing for the countless lives that make a famous kingdom real. Solon listened as a man who knew that wealth was never merely material. It shaped posture, speech, marriage, law, hospitality, and the way a people imagined the future. Atlantis had received a land so complete that its rulers might have become guardians of balance. Instead, the same completeness would later make the island vulnerable to the illusion that no boundary truly applied to it. The priest did not say this as a lesson, for he had no need. The island itself had already said it. Its metals, animals, fruits, waters, forests, and fields stood before the listener like a table laid for a feast, whose guests had not yet decided whether to give thanks or reach endlessly for more. That table, richly laid by nature and human order, waited in the story with a quiet tension, for abundance always asked what kind of soul would sit before it. He could almost see how difficult gratitude became when blessing ceased to surprise those who inherited it. Because the island was so richly supplied, its greatness did not have to begin in desperation. That fact gave the tragedy a sharper edge. Peoples driven by hunger might become harsh from fear, but Atlantis had been given more than survival. It had enough to build, enough to worship, enough to trade, enough to feed memory with festival and lore. Its later hunger, therefore, could not be blamed on emptiness. The priest's description of abundance was not filler before the real story. It was one of the story's foundations. It showed that the island stood before a moral choice made more difficult by comfort, whether to let wealth support order or let order become the servant of wealth. The feast had not yet turned dark, but the stillness around it already suggested that plenty would eventually ask for judgment. The sacred rings around Cleito's hill did not remain untouched by later hands. Generations of Atlanteans cut through the belts of land, joined the sea to the inner circles, and made passages wide enough for ships to move toward the royal center. What had once been divine enclosure became engineered access. The transformation was astonishing, and the priest described it with the admiration due to human skill when it still obeyed the original pattern. Bridges crossed from ring to ring, harbors formed within the circular waters, walls rose along the belts of land, each surface receiving stone and metal according to its place. The city did not sprawl by accident. It unfolded like a measured instrument, designed to draw movement inward and to remind every arrival that the center belonged to the descendants of Poseidon. The builders did not erase the god's design. They entered it with tools, transforming wonder into infrastructure, while trying to keep its sacred symmetry intact. The outermost works received ships from the open sea, and from there the routes narrowed into more ordered spaces. Merchants, officials, rowers, envoys, and craftsmen would have passed beneath gates and across bridges, their movements guided by water and wall. Cargo did not simply enter Atlantis, it was processed through a ceremonial geography. The city's plan made approach feel like initiation. Each ring placed the traveler closer to the palace, the temples, and the memory of the god's first enclosure. Yet the same design that inspired awe also displayed control. A visitor could not forget that Atlantis understood channels, thresholds, and guarded access. Even its beauty taught obedience before a word of command was spoken. Thus, every arrival became a lesson in hierarchy, for the city taught the body to move inward before the mind had time to question the meaning of the journey. Stonecutters, sailors, and overseers would have known each crossing by use before poets knew it by wonder. The walls themselves carried meaning through the metals with which they were adorned. One ring shone with one substance, another with another, and the innermost brilliance drew the eye toward the sacred height. The city's builders seemed to have turned geology into hierarchy. Stone supported metal, metal caught light, light announced rank. In calmer ages, such arrangement might have deepened reverence, but as the city grew richer, the surfaces could also flatter power until power mistook reflection for truth. The priest let Solon see the workmanship without rushing toward judgment. He gave him the pleasure of the scene, sunlight moving across bright facings, seawater darkening under bridges, ships resting within circular harbors, as if held in the palm of a deliberate hand. Such surfaces made public space into a language of rank, beautiful enough to inspire loyalty and dangerous enough to make inequality appear divinely arranged. The channels gave sound to the city as well as movement, carrying the knock of oars and the low calls of harbor work toward the royal center. Beyond the central rings stretched the wider city and its plain, connected by channels, roads, and ordered divisions. The great canal from the sea gave the island's heart a direct breath of ocean. Other works managed movement across the plain, making the land useful at a scale that revealed both patience and command. Measurements were preserved in the old account, but they did not need to stand as lifeless numbers. They suggested the enormity of labor, countless hands cutting, carrying, planning, aligning, repairing, and maintaining a system that bound agriculture, defense, ceremony, and trade into one design. Atlantis was not merely wealthy. It was organized wealth, wealth given architecture, schedule, depth, and direction. The numbers in the old account mattered because they hinted at endurance, the recurring maintenance, the seasonal work, and the administrative memory required to keep such a system alive. Every bridge joined what the original rings had separated, and every passage taught the islanders that access itself could be arranged, taxed, guarded, and made beautiful. In the city's daily life, the rings would have made sound as much as spectacle. Water struck stone softly beneath bridges. Oars dipped in enclosed harbors. Wheels moved over causeways. Voices traveled across courts and quays, sometimes sharp with business, sometimes low with reverence near the sacred precinct. At evening, the metals on the walls would not have blazed equally. Some surfaces would have dimmed, some would have held the last light, and the central height would have remained visible after lesser structures had softened into shadow. A child growing up there might have believed the city eternal because everything around him seemed built to guide, protect, and endure. Sound completed what sight began, giving Atlantis not only form but pulse. as if the whole city were a measured instrument played by water, labor, and command. The city's order could calm the eye, yet it also trained the mind to believe that whatever could be measured could be possessed. Yet beneath the harmony of the plan lay a question the city itself could not answer. When men inherited a divine pattern and improved it with human mastery, did they become more obedient to its meaning or more confident in their own hands? Atlantis had made the rings passable. It had opened the sea road to the center. It had turned sacred separation into imperial movement. The achievement was magnificent, and the magnificence was part of the danger. Solon, hearing this in the temple of Sais, would have felt the double edge. A city that could shape land and water so completely might learn discipline from its own works, or it might one day believe that every boundary, even those given by gods and nature, existed to be crossed. The question remained beneath the stones like a second foundation, quieter than the canals, but no less important to the fate of the island. Seen from above, the city might have resembled a thought made visible. Center, circle, passage, boundary, return. Seen from within, it was a living maze of duties and permissions. The same canal that carried a ship inward also reminded its crew that every approach had been anticipated by the rulers. The same bridge that joined one ring to another also displayed the power to decide who crossed and when. Atlantis had mastered circulation, and circulation became a political idea as much as an engineering success. The priest's account let that idea grow quietly. A city so skilled at arranging movement would later believe it could arrange the movement of nations as well. Its beauty remained undeniable, but the pattern had begun to feel less like protection and more like a habit of command. At the center of the island stood the temple of Poseidon, and the priest's account slowed as it entered that place. The building rose within the holy ground where Cleito and the god had first begun the royal line, and its proportions carried a grandeur that later Greek ears might have found foreign, heavy, and magnificent. Its exterior shone with precious coverings. Its pinnacles caught gold light. Within, ivory, silver, gold, and orichalcum gave the sacred chamber a density of brightness almost difficult to imagine. Yet the temple was not only a display of wealth, it was the island's memory made architectural. Every surface seemed to say that Atlantis had not forgotten where its kings came from, even if remembering origin was not the same as obeying it. A person entering it would not merely have seen wealth, he would have felt himself crossing into the accumulated demand of ancestry. Inside stood the image of Poseidon, represented in divine command, with horses and attendant figures arranged in a composition fit for the god of the sea. Around the sanctuary were images of the royal descendants and their wives, offerings from successive generations that turned family memory into public reverence. The effect must have been overwhelming. A worshipper entering that space would have felt surrounded by ancestry, metal, reflection, and the silent claim that the ruling houses belong to a sacred continuity. The temple did not speak in a human voice, but it carried the pressure of many voices from the past. It asked each king to stand beneath the eyes of those who had received power before him. The images created a court of memory, and every living ruler who approached them had to appear, however briefly, as one more temporary figure among older witnesses. Those who entered would have lowered their voices instinctively, not because anyone ordered silence, but because the surfaces themselves seemed to collect sound. Year by year, offerings came from the 10 royal portions to that central shrine. The movement of tribute was ceremonial, not merely economic. It tied the outer allotments back to the center and reminded each ruler that his authority was part of a shared origin. A festival in such a place would have joined abundance, obligation, and spectacle. Animals moved through the sacred precinct. Priests prepared the rites. Kings came not as isolated lords, but as members of a divine family whose internal order mattered to the peace of the whole island. The people who watched, served, or heard reports of the ritual would have understood that Atlantis was governed not only by walls and canals, but by repeated acts of remembrance. Because the offerings returned from every allotment, the temple became the point where political division was ritually gathered back into shared dissent. The gleam was sacred, yet it also taught the worshipper to expect the sacred in the language of costly things. There was a solemn beauty in those rites, and the story should not flatten it into hypocrisy too soon. For a long time, the kings of Atlantis were said to have followed the laws handed down to them. They gathered, honored the god, renewed their bonds, and judged matters among themselves according to the ancient inscription. In the temple's glow, surrounded by offerings and ancestral images, their power was made answerable to something older than personal will. That arrangement, while it lasted, gave Atlantis an inward strength that mere wealth could not produce. The island's greatness did not begin as disorder. It began with a form of discipline, and that made the later weakening more painful. This earlier obedience mattered, for without it Atlantis would have been only a warning. With it, the island became a true tragedy, capable of losing something noble. A child brought there for the first time might have remembered less doctrine than brightness. Height and the pressure of adult faces turned upward. Still, splendor had its own quiet appetite. The more richly the temple shone, the easier it became for human eyes to linger on surfaces and miss the command beneath them. Gold could honor a god, but it could also teach rulers to confuse reverence with possession. Orichalcum could line pillars in sacred brilliance, but it could also make holiness seem guaranteed by material magnificence. The priest did not need to accuse the Atlanteans openly. The temple contained the tension. It was both sanctuary and mirror, both remembrance and temptation. It preserved the first union of Poseidon and Cleito, yet it also showed how far the descendants had traveled from the lonely hill where the divine enclosure had begun. The sanctuary therefore held two kinds of radiance at once, one that honored the god, and another that slowly trained human desire to love its own reflection. The god's house therefore carried two memories at once: the first enclosure of Cleito's hill, and the later confidence of a people able to cover worship with splendor. Solon, who knew that laws without habits became ornaments, might have understood the temple more deeply than a wonder-seeker. He could have admired the brilliance and still asked whether the souls of the rulers remained equal to the place that received them. Every city had such a question at its center, though few asked it beneath roofs of ivory and metals. The Temple of Poseidon stood as the heart of Atlantis, but a heart could be burdened by what was laid upon it. The annual offering still came. The images still watched. The god still held his place in the sanctuary. Yet beyond the polished surfaces, the story had begun to lean toward the darker chamber, where kings sat in judgment after the fires were put out. From there, the story moved naturally toward law, because no temple, however splendid, could preserve a people if the rulers ceased to let themselves be judged. For this reason, the temple chapter of the story had to be more than description. It was the place where sacred memory, royal legitimacy, and material brilliance met in one overwhelming form. If the city's canals showed how Atlantis organized movement, the temple showed how it organized meaning. Every offering returned to the beginning. Every royal image looked backward and forward at once. Every precious surface implied continuity. Yet continuity could be a dangerous comfort. A people could stand inside the same sanctuary for generations and gradually change what they brought into it. The building would remain, the rite would remain, the god's name would remain, while the inward posture of those who entered slowly altered. The temple stood as a wonder, but within its wonder lay the question of whether devotion had been clarified by wealth or slowly covered by it. The 10 kings of Atlantis did not rule as strangers joined by convenience. They belonged to the same sacred descent, yet each held authority over his own portion of the island and its people. Their power within their allotments was great, but among one another they were bound by the laws of Poseidon, inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the central temple. That pillar stood where royal ambition had to pass before ancestral command. It was not a scroll hidden in a private chamber, nor a memory left to flattering singers. It was a visible standard, placed in the holiest precinct, near the offerings and images that reminded the rulers of their origin. Atlantis depended on that balance: wide authority outward, restraint inward, and a law older than any living king. The arrangement gave the island flexibility without anarchy, but it depended on rulers who accepted that kinship alone could not replace obedience. At appointed intervals, the kings gathered to deliberate and renew the bonds among them. The old account preserved a ritual involving bulls within the sacred precinct, but the force of the scene lay less in physical detail than in the discipline demanded of rulers who might otherwise have lived above correction. They entered the ceremony not as men displaying command over others, but as men required to submit their own power to inherited order. The rite brought the body, the law, the god, and the royal family into one solemn act. It would have been easier for rulers simply to feast, receive praise, and issue decrees. Instead, the ancient custom placed them under a gaze that made authority feel heavy. Its value lay in making kings remember that their bodies, decisions, and reputations belonged to an order larger than the appetite of any single throne. The animals in the precinct, the vessels, and the solemn handling of the rite made royal authority feel answerable to something older than individual will. After the offerings and formal acts, they drank according to the rite, swore to judge by the laws on the pillar, and prayed that obedience would remain stronger than private advantage. The ceremony then moved into a darker register. When night came, and the sacred fire was lowered or extinguished, The kings put on dark robes and sat upon the ground near the embers. In that reduced light, stripped of the day's metallic brilliance, they judged accusations against one another. No crowd's admiration softened the scene. No gold wall could fully protect a guilty conscience from the silence of peers. It was one of the most powerful images in the whole account. Rulers of a radiant island choosing darkness so that law might speak more clearly. In that darkness, the sacred center became less a place of display than a place of exposure, and the ruler's silence carried more force than proclamation. In such a chamber, character revealed itself not through speeches but through posture. One king might sit rigidly, guarding his pride behind stillness. Another might lower his eyes toward the fading fire, aware that the accusation before him touched not only policy but the old divine line. A third might listen with the careful patience of a man who feared disorder more than shame. The ritual worked because it forced those accustomed to command into the discomfort of mutual judgment. Atlantis remained strong while that discomfort was accepted. Its kings could rule widely because, at least among themselves, they consented to be measured. Even a small hesitation in that chamber could have changed the course of a dispute, because men accustomed to command were forced to hear judgment without spectacle. The room asked them to become smaller than their offices for a while, and some obeyed that demand more easily than others. The Pillar of Orichalcum did more than preserve rules. It preserved the possibility that power could remember its source. The laws regulated relations among the royal houses, forbade destructive conflict within the family, and required common counsel in matters of great importance. They made kingship a trust rather than a private appetite. The priest's account allowed Solon to see how carefully the island's constitution had once been arranged. Atlantis was not a cautionary tale because it lacked law. It was a cautionary tale because even strong laws could weaken when the souls entrusted to them grew less willing to be shaped by what they had inherited. The Pillar's authority was therefore practical as well as sacred. It organized rivalry before rivalry could harden into the fracture of the royal house. A ruler who touched that pillar touched a memory of restraint. Whether he loved that restraint was another matter. For many generations, according to the story, the divine portion within the Atlanteans remained sufficiently strong. They bore prosperity with composure, treated wealth as lighter than virtue, and did not lose themselves before the brightness of their possessions. The dark-robed judgment still meant something then. The pillar still stood not as decoration, but as a living command. Yet every repeated rite faced the danger of becoming performance. The same gestures could continue after reverence thinned. The same robes could be worn by men who feared humiliation more than injustice. The same pillar could shine before eyes trained to see its metal and not its law. In that possibility, Atlantis entered the shadowed passage from order into display. The danger was not that the rite vanished, but that it could survive as form after its power over conscience had begun to fade. Prosperity surrounded them, but in those better generations it had not yet taught them to despise limits. So the story's most cinematic scene was not a battle, but a judgment. The kings in darkness embodied the tension that held Atlantis together, immense outward power made answerable, at least for a time, to inward restraint. Their seated bodies, lowered lights, and solemn garments turned government into an act of self-limitation. The listener could almost feel the cool ground beneath them and the pressure of the pillar nearby. Nothing in that chamber needed to move quickly. Its power came from slowness, from the expectation that each ruler would let the law approach him more closely than flattery ever could. While that expectation lived, Atlantis remained more than a rich island. It remained a disciplined order. That image held because it joined ritual beauty to political danger, and because every later failure would seem darker beside those extinguished flames. The change in Atlantis did not arrive like a storm breaking a clear sky. It moved through generations with the quiet persistence of a habit allowed to remain uncorrected. The divine portion in the royal nature, once strong enough to steady abundance, was said to have grown faint as mortal character mixed and multiplied. The story did not require the old priest to accuse each king by name. Decline rarely needed one face to become real. It appeared in the way judgments were delayed, in the way ceremonies became more concerned with precedence than humility, in the way gifts to the temple grew larger while the inward act of offering grew smaller. Atlantis did not awaken one morning wicked. It became less able to feel the weight of what it already knew. Such decline was difficult to resist because it wore the clothing of continuity, allowing each generation to believe it had merely inherited what the previous one had already permitted. The city continued to function, and that made the change harder to see. Ships still entered through the canals, offerings still came to the sacred center, the great plain still produced, the temple still shone. To outward eyes, Atlantis may even have looked stronger than before, because wealth had a way of disguising spiritual fatigue as confidence. Yet within the royal houses, old restraint became less attractive. Men praised firmness when they meant appetite, expansion when they meant restlessness, and honor when they meant the refusal to be contradicted. The law on the pillar remained where it had always stood, but more of those who passed it treated it as part of the ancestral scenery. This was why the island could appear most secure at the very moment when its inner discipline had begun to loosen beneath the polished order of daily life. The old forms remained, but the hands that performed them had begun to move with less inward reverence. In the dark sessions of judgment, the old discomfort weakened. Kings still sat beneath ritual shadows, but some entered the chamber already calculating advantage. The darkness that had once humbled them became theatrical. Their robes no longer made them equal before the law. They became another costume worn by power. A ruler accused by his peers might listen with a face trained into solemnity, while his thoughts moved toward alliance, retaliation, or delay. Another might invoke Poseidon's name with careful reverence, and then leave the sanctuary to widen his own portion's influence. Nothing in such scenes needed to be loud. The deepest corruption often spoke in lowered voices, with the correct words placed in the correct order. The old forms still gave cover to new intentions, and that mixture made corruption harder to name than open rebellion would have been. In such small gestures, decline entered the story more convincingly than any public confession could have done. Among the people, the change was felt through distance. Those who worked fields, harbors, roads, and workshops still gave the city its strength, but the royal center drew more of the island's meaning toward display. Processions became longer. Metal surfaces were renewed with greater frequency. Envoys were received in rooms arranged to overwhelm them before negotiation began. Young nobles learned the genealogies of the 10 houses with pride, but not always the discipline those genealogies demanded. They inherited the memory of Poseidon as distinction more easily than as obligation. The island's first protection had been circular, measured, and sacred. Its later imagination became linear, outward, and hungry for recognition beyond the sea. From the lower districts, this distance may have seemed like majesty. From the inner life of the city, it was the slow removal of rulers from the measure of ordinary need. No single act announced the change. It gathered through preferences, delays, courtesies withheld, and honors given to what glittered most. The priest's account did not reduce this decline to one moral sentence, because the tragedy was more convincing when seen in motion. A king paused before the orichalcum pillar and looked not at the law, but at his own reflection in its surface. A council heard reports of distant coasts and considered not how to preserve peace, but how to turn opportunity into submission. Priests maintained the rituals with care, yet their carefulness could not replace the ruler's inward obedience. The city remained beautiful. That was part of its sorrow. Nothing in the brightness of its walls warned the careless eye that a people could become less worthy while their buildings became more splendid. The scene required no dramatic accusation, because the misdirected gaze of the king already revealed how a sacred object could become a flattering surface. The island still looked whole from afar, and that wholeness made the alteration more dangerous to those living inside it. Zeus, in the later movement of the account, would perceive what men within Atlantis had failed to see clearly. Before that divine perception entered the story, however, the human movement had to be allowed its full course. Atlantis had become powerful enough to look beyond its own abundance and imagine the inner sea not as a neighboring world, but as a field for command. The first rings had protected Cleito. The later canals had admitted ships. Now the royal will began to travel farther than either protection or commerce required. A realm that had once been organized around a sacred center turned its attention outward, and beyond the pillars, the waters leading inward grew heavy with consequence. The turn was not sudden, yet once it gathered enough force, the whole island's magnificent organization seemed ready to serve a purpose different from the one that had founded it. This chapter of decline therefore moved by alteration rather than incident. It did not require a single villain to step forward and announce the island's fall. The Atlanteans changed by becoming less disturbed by their own excess. What had once required justification became custom. What had once been received with reverence became assumed. What had once been checked by law became negotiated by advantage. The divine portion, in the language of the old account, did not disappear in one generation. It grew thin enough that mortal impulses could speak more loudly while still borrowing sacred names. That was why the danger felt so plausible. Atlantis did not abandon its identity. It learned to use that identity in a different way. By then, the rings still held their shape, but the inward meaning that had once justified them had begun to loosen. The turn toward the inner sea began as policy before it became danger. Atlantis had ships, resources, trained rulers, and a geography that made outward movement seem natural. Its harbors could gather fleets without strain. Its canals could feed men, materials, and orders toward the coast. Its royal houses could coordinate power across the island's divisions when ambition gave them a common object. From beyond the Pillars, the Atlantean command extended into regions that older peoples knew by other names and fears. Parts of Libya came under its pressure toward Egypt, and parts of Europe felt its reach toward Tyrrhenia. In the old priest's account, the movement was not a border skirmish or a boastful raid. It was an organized expansion of a great Western power into the political world around the Mediterranean. This administrative calm made the expansion more unsettling, for conquest that moved through system and calculation could feel almost respectable to those who benefited from it. To those who first heard of the Atlanteans from a distance, their approach may have seemed almost ceremonial. Envoys arrived before soldiers. Agreements preceded demands. Harbors learned to receive ships bearing the authority of the island. Local rulers, weighing their strength against a sea empire, could choose submission and call it prudence. Traders adapted quickly, as traders often did. Priests and elders might have watched the new order settle over old roots with a mixture of unease and resignation. The pressure of Atlantis did not need to destroy a city in order to change it. It could make a people adjust its speech, its tribute, its alliances, and its expectation of what resistance would cost. Submission, when repeated from port to port, became part of the atmosphere, until resistance seemed not only dangerous, but strangely out of date. By the time command became visible, many smaller choices had already made refusal difficult. The Atlantean rulers saw their own expansion through the language of capacity. They had wealth enough to support fleets, ancestry enough to justify command, and organization enough to make scattered opposition appear childish. In their halls, maps and reports would have carried a quiet intoxication. Coastlines that had once been names became potential possessions. Straits became instruments. Islands became stepping stones. Men who had grown among rings and canals understood how to connect spaces, how to draw movement toward a center. The same intelligence that had made their city beautiful now served imperial appetite. Their talent did not vanish. It was redirected, and that redirection made it more formidable. The maps in such rooms would have looked silent and harmless, yet every line across them carried the future unease of real communities. Power described itself as order because order was the noblest word available to it. Yet the inner sea was not empty. It held cities with their own gods, laws, quarrels, and memories. Some had already bent beneath Atlantean influence. Others watched, uncertain whether the Western power would pass them by or claim them in time. The old account made clear that Atlantis gathered enough force to threaten not one settlement, but many peoples together. It moved toward a condition in which the freedom of the Mediterranean world could be drawn into a single system of command. That was why the story mattered to the priest of Sais, and why it could not remain a marvel of architecture. Atlantis had become a question placed before other civilizations, whether wealth joined to ambition would meet any boundary it could not absorb. The account therefore gave the expansion moral depth without needing to invent speeches of cruelty. The danger was visible in the narrowing of choices around free peoples. In Athens, the older Athens before Solon's memory, the danger took another form. The city had been trained by its own simplicity and law. Its guardians were not richer than other men, and its honor was not displayed through metals or fleets. Such a city could not meet Atlantis by imitation. It had no equal splendor to set against the western island, no broader empire, no greater abundance. Its strength lay in a different measure, one that seemed almost poor beside Atlantean magnificence. That contrast gave the coming conflict its weight. It would not be a contest between two similar powers, but between two ideas of order, one expanding through command, the other standing through discipline. Their poverty beside Atlantis was not weakness in the story, but contrast, the kind that made the coming test sharper and more intelligible. That plainness did not make Athens weak. It made the city harder for imperial imagination to understand. As Atlantis turned inward from the outer ocean, the story's rhythm changed. The earlier chapters of its greatness had been circular: hill, rings, temple, laws, and annual return. Now the movement became directional, pressing through the pillars and along the coasts. Solon, listening in Egypt, would have recognized the political seriousness beneath the mythic frame. A people's founding shape did not imprison its future, but it could echo through every later choice. Atlantis had learned to draw roads and waters toward its center. At last it sought to make nations move the same way. Across the inner sea, the pressure gathered, and the ancient Athenians found themselves facing a power that had made grandeur itself feel inevitable. Thus the outward turn of Atlantis became the hinge of the whole tragedy, where sacred order finally changed into political pressure upon the world beyond itself. The turn toward empire also changed the emotional temperature of the story. Until this point, Atlantis could still be admired from within its own borders. Its grandeur had rested in origin, abundance, skill, and ritual. Now those same strengths began to affect other peoples who had not asked to be gathered into its order. The priest did not have to invent cruelty to make the turn alarming. A civilization could become dangerous simply by making its own greatness the measure of everyone else's future. The inner sea, with its many cities and memories, became the space where Atlantis would test that belief. Across those waters, the forgotten Athens waited, poor in splendor, but rich in discipline. The sea lanes that had once promised exchange now seemed to draw the island toward a test no harbor could contain. The host from the Atlantic did not need to be imagined as a disorderly wave. Its terror lay in its order. Ships moved from the western sea with the confidence of a realm accustomed to command long before it reached the shores it intended to master. Their prows cut the water in disciplined lines. Their crews carried the habits of harbors built in rings. Their officers belonged to a system in which 10 royal houses had learned to act together when appetite and strategy aligned. The old priest's account did not preserve individual captains or the names of common sailors, and the absence made the force seem larger. It came as an empire comes, with many hands, many oars, many voices, and one pressure felt by every coast ahead of it. The sea, which had once framed their sacred island, now carried its organized will toward lands that had not shared in its founding vows. In the lands already touched by Atlantean power, news of the advancing host would have traveled faster than the ships themselves. Messengers reached cities where councils sat late into the evening, weighing fear against honor. Some peoples who might have stood beside Athens withdrew, not always through cowardice, but through the exhausted calculation of communities that had families, fields, and temples to preserve. Others had already been constrained by treaties or tribute. By the time the full danger faced the older Athenians, the loneliness of resistance had become part of the trial. The priest's account made this loneliness central. Athens did not merely join a convenient alliance. It came, in the decisive hour, to stand when others had fallen away. Each council's hesitation added to the isolation of Athens, and the growing isolation gave the coming resistance the gravity of a choice made without comfort. The farther the fleet moved, the more its order felt like a single intention spread across many hulls. The approaching Atlanteans carried more than weapons and ships. They carried the visual force of their civilization. Their banners, armor, commands, and naval discipline reflected a land of metals, canals, and royal law turned outward. To those watching from threatened coasts, the host must have seemed like Atlantis itself set in motion. The temple's brightness darkened into military order, the rings uncoiled into roots of command, the abundance of the island converted into provisions, hulls, and resolve. Yet the story remained YouTube safe in its deepest drama, because its power did not depend on graphic harm. It depended on the sight of a vast, organized will meeting the fragile line where another people refused to disappear. The host's visible order made it harder to dismiss as mere violence. It was civilization itself, disciplined and brilliant, turned toward domination. Every sail carried not only men and provisions, but the assumption that distance itself would yield. Athens prepared without the theatrical confidence of a wealthier empire. Its defenders had been formed by a civic order that valued discipline over display. Their readiness showed in quieter ways. In the arrangement of posts, the steady bearing of guardians, the absence of frantic ornament, and the way citizens understood that the danger belonged to the whole city. The old account praised them, not because they were many, but because they did not measure courage by number alone. Their leaders knew that the Atlantean advance had already bent other places. They also knew that a city could lose itself before a battle if it first accepted the invader's idea of inevitability. Their steadiness had to be felt in details of preparation, because a city's courage was most believable when shown through repeated acts before the decisive hour. Even fear seemed to grow quiet before such organization, as if the coastlines needed time to understand the scale of what approached. The first meetings of the conflict were not preserved as a sequence of named blows, and a responsible telling did not pretend otherwise. What could be drawn from the account was the shape of struggle, pressure from the Atlantic, resistance from the older Athens, and a widening recognition that the imperial movement could be checked. The sea that had carried Atlantean confidence inward became a field of uncertainty. Commands passed from ship to ship, coastal routes no longer promised easy submission. On land, the Athenians held with a severity that made their modest city appear larger than its material means. The drama lay in reversal, not spectacle. A power accustomed to expansion encountered a people whose order did not yield to grandeur. This restraint also honored the source, which preserved the achievement rather than the mechanics of every encounter, leaving the narrative to carry weight through shape and consequence. As the host pressed forward, the contrast between Atlantis and Athens sharpened until it became almost visible in the air. One side carried the accumulated brightness of an island realm that had mistaken reach for right. The other carried the disciplined memory of a city whose greatness would later be forgotten by its own descendants. The priest's voice, as Solon heard it, must have lowered here, not from lack of importance, but from the gravity of a decisive passage. The outcome had not yet been spoken in the story's full light. What mattered in that moment was the meeting itself, the western host before the older city, the inner sea holding its breath, and the knowledge that even the mightiest order could discover another kind of strength standing in its path. That suspended moment gave the battle its emotional center, not noise, but the stillness before two different forms of order tested one another. The war therefore entered the narrative not as sudden noise, but as the visible consequence of everything that had come before. The sacred rings, the disciplined kings, the abundant fields, the organized canals, and the outward hunger all converged upon the advancing host. Atlantis had become mobile. What once stood in metal and stone now moved in timber, sail, command, and expectation. Against it stood a city whose earlier chapters had prepared the listener to understand its courage. The conflict was not important because armies met. It was important because two forms of order, one swollen by reach and one hardened by restraint, finally occupied the same horizon. The horizon had become a boundary between two ideas of power, and neither could pass through the other unchanged. When allies fell away and pressure closed around the struggle, the ancient Athenians stood in the severe clarity of a city reduced to its own character. Their courage did not become loud, it became concentrated. The priest's account praised them because they endured the trial not as men seeking spectacle, but as guardians of a larger freedom that many others could no longer defend openly. In the camps, courts, and passes where decisions were made, the mood must have held both fear and steadiness. No responsible retelling needed to invent heroic speeches. The deepest force of the scene came from the fact that the Athenians acted without guarantee that anyone would preserve their names correctly afterward. The city's solitude did not make it smaller in the account. It made its outline clearer, like a ridge seen after clouds had drawn away. Their strength became visible in the way ordinary gestures continued under pressure. A gate secured, a message carried, a weary guard replaced before his attention failed. The Atlantean force, used to the momentum of submission, met resistance that did not flatter it by panic. Athens could not equal the island's splendor, but it could deny the island's conclusion. That denial was the center of the conflict. The older Athenians fought, maneuvered, guarded, and endured with the discipline of people whose civic habits had prepared them for danger long before danger arrived. The story did not require graphic description to make the struggle serious. One could feel its weight in the weariness of defenders returning to their posts, in the quiet repair of shields and ships, in the watchfulness of commanders who knew that a single lapse could open the way for a power that had already crossed too many boundaries. Such endurance gave the story its human scale, allowing the listener to feel the cost of resistance without being forced through harsh detail. The refusal spread through actions before it could be named as victory. As the conflict turned, Atlantis discovered that material greatness did not make resistance vanish. The imperial host had come from beyond the pillars, with the breadth of many conquered expectations behind it. But Athens refused to become another adjusted coast. The reversal would have unfolded through many small acts before it became visible as victory. A held position, a failed pressure, a route denied, a command delayed, a confidence disturbed. The Atlanteans did not cease to be formidable. That made the Athenian achievement greater. The old priest's praise was not for easy triumph. It was for the capacity of a smaller, stricter order to withstand a larger force without becoming its mirror. Every denied route became a quiet answer to the island's assumption that all routes eventually led toward its command. Its commanders could still measure ships and provisions, but they could not measure the stubbornness of a city that had learned to belong to itself. At last the Athenians prevailed, freeing not only themselves but others who had been threatened by the Western power. The victory, in the priest's account, did not become a noisy celebration. Its moral force lay in deliverance. Cities that had feared permanent subjection could breathe again. The inner sea was not gathered into one command. The advance from Atlantis had been checked by a people whose later descendants would barely remember them. Solon, hearing this, must have felt pride troubled by sorrow. To learn that one city had once saved others would stir any patriot. To learn that such greatness had been lost from living memory would make the praise feel almost like mourning. The victory's restraint mattered, for deliverance spoken softly could feel more ancient and durable than triumph shouted across a temporary field. Relief did not arrive as noise. It arrived first as the knowledge that the advancing weight had stopped. The Atlanteans, defeated in their great movement inward, stood at the edge of a deeper change. Their failure against Athens was not yet the sinking of the island, but it broke the spell of inevitability. A realm that had arranged land and water, gathered wealth, bound kings by law, and extended dominion across coasts had met a limit it could not absorb. In the old pattern of tragedy, such a moment mattered as much as catastrophe. It was the instant when the world revealed that power had been mistaken about itself. Atlantis had believed its outward motion natural. Athens showed that another order could stop it. In that broken certainty lay the turning of the narrative, because Atlantis had been defeated first in its imagination of itself. What had seemed like destiny now had the shape of a failed attempt, and that change entered the Atlantean spirit more deeply than any shouted defeat. After the victory, the story did not linger in triumph because the earth itself had not finished speaking. The same ages that had erased records and humbled nations still moved beneath human events. The Athenians had won, yet memory would not protect them from later loss. Atlantis had been checked, yet its island remained heavy with all that had accumulated in it: wealth, ancestry, pride, beauty, law, and failure. The priest's account drew the listener toward a quieter dread. Human conflict had reached its decision, but the wider world waited beyond councils and armies. In the silence after resistance and defeat, sea and land began to gather the final movement of the tale. The hush after the struggle prepared the listener for a different kind of power, one that no courage or empire could negotiate with once it began to move. The same stillness that follows exertion settled over the account, and in that stillness, another force waited without argument. The priest's praise of Athens reached its deepest point here, yet it remained controlled. He did not need to turn the defenders into flawless statues. Their greatness lay in the fact that human beings, vulnerable to fatigue and fear, nevertheless held to the shape their city had given them. They had been prepared by law before they were tested by empire. That preparation allowed them to stand after allies failed, after pressure mounted, after the Western host seemed too large to resist. In the quiet force of their endurance, the earlier description of ancient Athens fulfilled its purpose. The listener finally understood why the story had begun with them. Their deed stood firm precisely because the tale allowed it to remain human, disciplined, strained, mortal, and therefore worthy of remembrance. The grievous day and night came after the human trial, as if the world had held its greater judgment until men had revealed the truth of their own orders. The priest's account spoke of earthquakes and floods, not in a manner that invited spectacle, but with the grave compression of a record preserving what no ordinary description could hold. The earth moved. Waters rose and changed their courses. In the ancient imagination, such events did not feel separate from the moral shape of history, yet the telling did not need to force them into a simple punishment. They were larger than human argument. They entered the story as powers before which palaces, laws, fleets, and victories all became fragile. The calmness of the record made the event feel more immense, for only the largest disasters could be named so simply and still darken the entire story. The victory of Athens had not closed the age. It had opened a last and deeper stillness. For Athens, the catastrophe brought a sorrow almost beyond victory. The old city that had stood against Atlantis suffered so greatly that later generations lost the fuller memory of its deed. The land itself was altered across time by repeated disasters. Its soil diminished, its earlier fullness reduced. What had been praised in Egypt became absent in Greece. Survivors, if any remained in scattered uplands after such calamities, carried life forward before they could carry records. Children were born into a poorer knowledge. Names became legends, then fragments, then silence. Thus, the city that had saved others was itself hidden from its descendants, not because its courage had been small, but because nature had taken away the ordinary vessels of remembrance. This second loss made the Athenian victory almost unbearable in its beauty. They had saved others, yet could not save the memory of themselves. The story moved from human decision into a region where cities, however brave or splendid, became small beneath older forces. For Atlantis, the change was more final. The island that had stood beyond the pillars seat of Poseidon's descendants and center of a sea empire, was said to have sunk beneath the waters. The account did not require the reader to watch every wall fall or every chamber close. It was stronger to imagine the great circles overwhelmed in widening silence, harbors losing their boundaries, bridges swallowed by troubled water, temple brightness dimmed beneath mud and depth, the royal center passing from architecture into legend. The sea that had carried Atlantean ambition inward now covered the place from which that ambition had sailed. What had been designed around controlled water became unreachable through water's own excess. The vision was enough because absence completed what description could not. The mind supplied the slow closing of water more powerfully than any harsh detail could do. Afterward, the sea in that region was said to have become difficult to pass because of the mud left by the sunken island. This detail carried an extraordinary melancholy. Atlantis did not vanish into clean myth. It left obstruction, shoal, heaviness, a memory in the body of the sea itself. Sailors could not simply cross and forget. The route bore the trace of what had gone down. The island's disappearance was therefore not pure absence. It became a changed condition of travel, a warning embedded in navigation. Where once ships had moved from a mighty harbor toward the inner sea, later movement faltered above what remained below. That muddy aftermath made the island's fate linger in practical consequence, as if even disappearance had not released the sea from the burden of what it covered. The suddenness of the change made later memory feel incomplete, as though the world had turned a page before the witnesses could finish reading it. The old priest's restraint made the catastrophe more lasting than an ornate lament would have done. He did not need to describe panic in harsh terms. He did not need to dwell on suffering. The scale was enough. A civilization of rings, planes, metals, temples, laws, and kings had been reduced to a problem of memory and passage. Ancient Athens, too, had been stripped of the records that would have made its deed clear to its own children. In one movement of earth and water, victory and defeat alike were placed under the dominion of time. Human beings survived where they could, rebuilt where they must, and began again with less knowledge than their ancestors had possessed. The result was not only destruction, but a lowering of human knowledge, a reminder that civilizations could lose not only buildings, but the explanations of their own nobility. Solon, hearing this in Sais, stood before a conclusion that no poet could easily contain. He had come from a city proud of its laws and stories, only to learn that its older greatness had been preserved abroad while its own memory had failed at home. He had heard of Atlantis not as a traveler's fancy, but as the vast counterpart to a forgotten Athens, a realm magnificent enough to tempt admiration and grave enough to become warning. The priest's tale had moved from temple records to ancient virtue, from divine founding to imperial reach, from resistance to the day and night when earth and sea changed the fate of both peoples. The name Atlantis settled into the silence not as an ending, but as a weight. The weight did not resolve. It settled, and in settling it prepared the story for the divine silence that would follow. The catastrophe also changed the meaning of survival. To live after such an event was not simply to continue breathing. It was to inherit a world whose explanations had been torn away. Records were lost, landscapes altered, and descendants left with fragments where their ancestors had once possessed order. The old priest's calm made this inheritance feel even heavier. He spoke from a civilization that had kept records precisely because others had not been able to. In that contrast, Solon heard the full fragility of human greatness. A city could win the trial of courage and still lose the archive of its own courage to water, time, and forgetfulness. When Solon heard this, the room in Sais must have felt farther from the sea than ever, and yet filled with its weight. Yet the account preserved one more movement, stranger than any measurement of canals or description of war. After telling how the divine portion in the Atlanteans had grown faint and their mortal nature had become dominant, the story lifted its gaze above island and sea. Zeus, the god who ruled according to law and could see into such things, perceived that an honorable race had fallen into a grievous condition. He wished, according to the ancient account, to bring correction so that they might be chastened and made better. The language was solemn, and it did not feel like the anger of a lesser ruler. It felt like the attention of cosmic order turning toward a people no longer able to measure themselves. The phrasing preserved dignity even in correction, suggesting that divine judgment aimed not at spectacle, but at the restoration of measure. The scene rose not because the story needed spectacle, but because human judgment had reached its limit. Zeus gathered the gods into their most holy habitation, set at the center of the world, and able to behold all created things. The image widened the story to its greatest height. Far below lay Atlantis with its rings, harbors, temple, kings, and burdened splendor. Elsewhere lay the lands it had threatened and the older Athens that had resisted it. Above them all, in the divine center, the gods assembled not as decorations around a myth, but as witnesses to the seriousness of law. The place itself mattered. A council held at the center of the world suggested that the question of Atlantis was not regional, not merely political, not simply the failure of one island people. It touched the order by which greatness was judged. By lifting the scene there, the account made the island's fate part of a universal order, not merely the aftermath of military defeat. The gathered gods did not need to be described in crowded detail. Their presence was enough. Poseidon, whose portion Atlantis had been, Athena, whose city had stood against the western host, and the other divine powers before whom human magnificence became small. One could imagine Poseidon silent in a way no human silence could equal, carrying both the memory of Cleito's protected hill and the sight of what his descendants had become. Athena's stillness would not have been triumphal. The older Athens had prevailed, but it too would suffer loss beneath the movements of earth and water. In that divine chamber, victory and failure did not appear as they did in human songs. They were measured against law, order, and the long consequence of character. Their imagined stillness held the ache of two divine associations, the sea god's wounded inheritance and the goddess's city, victorious yet not untouched by loss. Then Zeus was said to have spoken. At that very threshold, the surviving dialogue broke off. No full speech followed. No sentence of divine judgment came down to explain the fate of Atlantis in finished terms. The silence left by the unfinished text became one of the most powerful spaces in the whole tradition. A lesser ending might have told the listener exactly what to think. This ending withheld the final utterance. It allowed the gathered gods, the sunken island, the forgotten victory, and Solon's listening face to remain suspended together. The reader stood where the words stopped, aware that some judgments in ancient stories were made heavier by not being fully heard. The broken sentence made the reader listen more intensely than a completed decree might have allowed, because silence demanded participation rather than passive acceptance. The break made the divine chamber colder and more spacious. One could almost hear the held breath before a word that history did not preserve. That silence did not empty the tale. It deepened it. Everything necessary had already been placed before the listener. The divine beginning, the abundance, the ordered city, the sacred laws, the thinning of restraint, the imperial movement, the resistance of Athens, and the catastrophe that followed. Zeus's unspoken judgment hovered over all these things without reducing them to a single moral formula. The old priest had given Solon a story preserved by records, yet the final break reminded every later age that even records had edges. Memory could carry a kingdom across centuries, but it could not always close the wound of what had been lost. The unfinished place therefore became a form of reverence toward the unknown, acknowledging that even a preserved story could not possess the whole of judgment. The missing speech became part of the inheritance, a place where certainty stopped and attention continued. So the account ended not with a command, but with an opening into silence. Atlantis remained visible beneath that silence more vividly than it might have beneath a completed speech. Its rings lay in the mind. Its temple still glimmered. Its kings still sat in dark robes near the fading fire. Its host still moved from the Atlantic toward the inner sea. Its island still went down beneath waters made heavy by mud and memory. Above all, Zeus remained at the center of the world with words withheld. The unfinished place in the story became a chamber of its own, and whoever entered it had to listen without being told exactly how to leave. It was there, at the edge of speech, that Atlantis became most enduring. Not fully explained, not fully erased, and impossible to reduce to a single lesson. The unfinished divine speech also protected the tale from becoming too neat. If Zeus had spoken at length, later listeners might have clung to the wording and forgotten the images that made judgment necessary. Instead, the break forced the whole story to remain active in the mind. The rings, the temple, the kings, the expansion, Athens, the floods, and the mud of the sea all gathered beneath the unsaid sentence. That gathering was the real conclusion. It left no easy comfort and no simple slogan. It left a silence large enough to hold both justice and loss. The silence left the gods assembled, the island submerged, and the law of measure present without needing a final sentence to announce itself. Long after Solon left the temples of Egypt, the account he had heard did not travel like a monument. It traveled like a lamp carried through narrow streets after sunset, small enough to be sheltered by a hand, bright enough to keep a face visible in the dark. Solon returned to the Greek world with laws still pressing upon his mind, and with an older wonder lodged beneath them. He had gone to Sais as a man honored among his own people, Yet he had listened there as a child before older records. The priest's words had not merely enlarged the past, they had unsettled his place inside it. Athens, which he had known through living custom and civic duty, had been shown to him as something deeper, older, and half forgotten. He intended, so the later account suggested, to give that ancient story poetic form, but public affairs and the limits of age drew him elsewhere. The tale remained unfinished in his hands, though not abandoned. From Solon the memory passed into the house of Dropides, and from that family path it reached Critias, who preserved it not as a sailor's boast or a market wonder, but as something received with ceremony. By the time the story entered philosophical conversation, the island had already crossed more than sea. It had crossed old age, family remembrance, civic pride, and the distance between Egyptian records and Greek speech. Critias carried it with the gravity of one repeating a thing too large to have invented lightly. In his telling, the name of Atlantis did not arrive alone. It brought with it Sais, Solon's listening face, the priest's correction of Greek forgetfulness, the lost achievement of ancient Athens, and the image of a Western power whose splendor had once seemed almost beyond measure. The story had become a vessel filled by many hands, and every hand had left a trace on its rim, like salt left drying on a cup after the sea had withdrawn from it. For later listeners, Atlantis was never only a drowned island. It was the memory of rings cut into land and sea, of a hill once guarded for Cleito, of Poseidon's portion divided among sons, of Atlas giving his name to both kingdom and ocean. It was the brightness of orichalcum on sacred walls, the weight of laws inscribed on a pillar, the dark robes of kings who judged by firelight after the flame had been lowered. It was also the slow danger hidden inside magnificence, the way a city could begin by honoring measure and later mistake its own abundance for permission. Those images endured because they did not stand apart from one another. The beauty made the danger harder to dismiss, and the danger made the beauty more fragile. A listener could admire the city and still feel the coldness gathering around its pride, as one might admire a tower while hearing stone shift somewhere within it. Nor did the older Athens vanish from the closing memory. In the Egyptian priest's account, that city had stood before its own descendants remembered it, and its greatness had not depended on golden surfaces or crowded harbors. Its people had been imagined through discipline, restraint, and service to a common order. When allies withdrew and fear spread around the inner sea, Athens remained alone in the path of the Atlantic host. The victory was not preserved as a loud triumph. It came down through the tale with the stillness of a deed nearly lost. Even success had been swallowed by time, for the same movements of earth and water that overcame Atlantis also erased much of what Athens had been in that ancient age. The saved deed and the drowned city rested strangely close together, both dependent on memory that almost failed, both spared from total darkness only by the care of a voice in an Egyptian temple. Beneath the waves, the kingdom could still be pictured, though no hand in the later world could lift its streets into certainty. The mind descended where maps could not follow. It passed over harbors gone quiet, bridges broken into dark suggestion, and walls dulled by depth. It imagined the temple of Poseidon sealed away from procession and song. the central hill held in a silence deeper than any royal command. Yet the vision remained honest when it remembered how it had reached the listener. Through Plato's dialogues, through Critias's family inheritance, through Solon's Egyptian hearing, through records said to be older than Greek memory. The descent was therefore not an excavation of stone, but a descent through transmission. Every layer of water became a layer of telling, and every shadow below the surface belonged as much to thought as to place. The imagined city did not become weaker for that. It became more haunting because it could not be reached by ships. The sea above that imagined kingdom grew calm again. Ships of later ages crossed waters that had once been made difficult by the mud of the sunken land, and the sailors who passed there did not hear the speeches of kings beneath them. Cities rose elsewhere, drew borders, built temples, argued about justice, forgot their own beginnings, and trusted their walls more than they should. The old account remained because it did not ask to be simple. It held wonder and warning in the same slow current. It allowed Atlantis to shine without becoming harmless, and it allowed its fall to grieve without turning into spectacle. Somewhere between Sais and Athens, between the priest's old records and Solon's unfinished poem, the lost kingdom became less a place to be found than a shape of remembrance. Under the quiet surface, the rings remained visible to the inward eye, and the listener left them there, luminous, distant, and still breathing inside the silence of the sea. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love.